After weeks of chaos and violence, the streets of Hong Kong remained largely peaceful this weekend, while anti-government protesters took to the streets to make their voices heard. At the same time, hundreds of thousands of residents, or over 100,000 residents, also joined an anti-violence rally to oppose violence and save Hong Kong. But is the relative peace there to stay? And how are the so-called silent majority only just beginning to gain traction? Joining me for the discussion in the Beijing studio is Witman Hung, a deputy from Hong Kong for the 13th National People's Congress, who was at Saturday's anti-violence rally, and via Skype from Singapore, Wang Jiangyu, director of the Asian Law Institute at the Faculty of Law at the National University of Singapore. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. First of all, let's reflect a little bit what happened over the weekend. And Mr. Hung, you were at the anti-violence rally on Saturday. Tell us a bit about exactly what were the objective of you and the other people who joined that rally, and how the atmosphere was like.
Well, the atmosphere is obviously quite warm, and also we have some, not just the local Chinese residents, but there was actually a British gentleman who had been in Hong Kong for 40 years, and he was there out crying for stop the violence. I think the main purpose is, as we can see from some of the slogans of the rioters and the protesters, especially they had one small gathering on the Friday night where they really push for this Paris Together theme, which is really alarming.
You mean people from the anti-government
There were a bunch of mostly university students, okay, and they were gathered together, and they said, they used the Cantonese word "lam cao," which means Paris Together.
So let me get it absolutely clear. While there was a larger scale rally by anti-government protesters on Sunday, actually a much smaller group of people gathered before that on Friday afternoon, you said, and they were calling for something like Paris Together. Exactly what were they asking for?
Yes, I mean, I think this is basically a demonstration that they're very dissatisfied with whatever the whole society, so they understand the price of having all this violence, and they still want to do it. So that is very alarming, especially to most of the other Hong Kong residents, I mean, people like me, taxi drivers, small business owners, and as well as large, conglomerate chairmen. I mean, I've seen actually on Saturday night, 4 of the largest companies in Hong Kong, who controls like anything from property to retail to television and entertainment. And these people also came out and voiced out, it's time to stop the violence, to save Hong Kong, because we're already seeing economic downturn, we're seeing the rising of unemployment, we're seeing companies closing down, we're seeing the dropping of tourists and businesses. So it's time to stop. We can.
But on the second day, you have an even bigger rally, right, by people who are opposed to the government, who are against the establishment. What were they calling for? And how come, after so many people coming out to voice support, to call for end of violence, are these larger group of people coming out to call for more violence?
No, actually, what happened yesterday is there was actually a relatively peaceful demonstration. Admittedly, hundreds of thousands of people, and they call for 2 things. One is what they have 5 demands where the government needs to respond. But the fact is, what they got it wrong is that the government did respond. The government just didn't agree. Okay, they did respond on every single item of those demands and explain why the government cannot just give in to those demands, because one of those things is to free everybody that was arrested. Now, Hong Kong has been a rule of law city for a very long time. If somebody's been arrested, they need to go through the investigation. Whether they are guilty or not is decided by the court, not by the administration. So this is a very simple answer to such a demand. But there is one major thing. The other thing is also they call for the investigation of the local police on the allegedly this overuse of power towards the protesters. Now that we already have actually a mechanism in Hong Kong. There's an independent organization called IPCC, And that one already had started, actually, an investigation, I know.
Okay, let me go to Professor Wang here. First of all, this message that the smaller group of protesters who gathered on Friday night, and they were calling for perish together, exactly. Professor Wang, what do you think they're calling for? It seems they're pretty reckless in trying to achieve what they want to achieve, despite the damage that Hong Kong might have already sustained.
Yeah, I think they constitute the worst part of the protests, and when we argue that the majority of the people would be peaceful and they want to ask for change and reform in the Hong Kong society, but you have lunatics in any population and in every society, and it's the voice of those people, the ridiculous, radical voice of those people make the protest looks very bad, very ugly. And I think they have to stop doing that.
Is there any possibility that this kind of reckless, this kind of radical ideas would be embraced by the larger group of people, some of whom are really having some grievances against the government and who joined the Sunday protest?
I don't think that will happen. The Hong Kong has been a rule of law-based society for many decades, and Hong Kong is a commercial cosmopolitan city, and the majority of the people in Hong Kong depends on trade and commerce. And this kind of radical protests, self-destructive radical protests, they disrupt trade and commerce, and they very much interfere in with the daily life of the Hong Kong people. And I think over time, the majority of the Hong Kong people will realize this is not the kind of life they want. And so they will ask those radicals to stop doing that. But of course, in the long run, meaningful reforms have to be taken to address the concerns of the people.
Is that the reason why, Mr. Hung here in the studio, is that the reason why that over 100,000 Hong Kong residents came out on the street to oppose violence, right? To call for rationality, to call for respect of the love for the place, you know, don't destroy Hong Kong. But on the other hand, there is also a very big crowd on the other side of the opinion. So what are we seeing here? Are we seeing a further polarization of public opinion, or are we seeing people resorting back to rationalism, to reason, at least for the moment?
I think actually we're not seeing neither of them. I think
what are we seeing then?
The polarization had already taken place, and it takes a while before that can be reconciled. What we're seeing is obviously, you know, those people who be against violence, who wants to have, you know, back to a normal life, are making their voice heard. On the other hand, the other group of people, I mean, it's not that they're not hearing such voices. It's not that they are not suffering. Some of them, they are suffering from this kind of violence as well. But for whatever reason, they still believe they want to support those radical protesters, no matter what they do. I mean, this is really against my, you know, knowledge of Hong Kong. One of the things I keep saying is how to end this. I mean, how to end this kind of turmoil for the 2 months. I mean, simple thing is the police to execute their duties to maintain law and order. The problem is you have people who, you know, have sympathy to those rioters right now, and it's not a small, you know, number of people. So the main thing is for those people who may be against the government, but also do not want violence. They need to, you know, basically say goodbye to those radical and violent people. Otherwise, this thing will never end, and at the end, we will perish together.
So, given so many people coming out on Sunday, you know, voicing their opposition towards the government, do you think that's going to send further emboldening messages to the small group of violent offenders, Mr. Hung?
I think yes and no. I think the whole thing is very well orchestrated and planned. So I think those violent people are also among the hundreds of thousands of people yesterday. Okay, and they were holding hands together. They say, "Oh, we know we may be different, but we are you know, we are violent and you are, you know, we are violent and brave and you are, you know, peaceful and, you know,
Cowardice.
rational. No, rational.
Rational.
But we are the same team. You know, this is one of the themes they keep pushing. We are one team. And they call it brothers climbing up the mountain using different ways. Okay, it's their own slogan. So that needs to be stopped. I mean, I think that needs to be also, I think what happened yesterday, it may not be an indication that this thing will become always peaceful, but at least it's a good sign that if both sides want to, you know, express some good signs, express some goodwill, they can't. And the Hong Kong government had already expressed that if everything settled down, they will want to start a real dialogue. Because the problem is dialogue with whom? Because apparently what they claim is this huge demonstration and protest, there was no leader. So if there's no leader, how can the government have a dialogue? I mean, that is another problem we need to solve, but at least.
Okay, Professor Wang, what are your answers to this question? I mean, this two opposing demonstrations over the weekend. What are we seeing here? Are we seeing further development, further worsening of the situation, or is this kind of apparent peace might last at least for a day or two, maybe a week or two?
I guess as you have indicated, the demonstrations have been rather peaceful in the past 3 days, in a stark contrast to the very violent behaviors of the protesters. A few days ago, the protesters had beaten people, innocent people, and assaulted the people who passed by. And so those are very wrong actions. I think very much because I think two reasons have contributed to the recent kind of the peace in, as you can see from the demonstrations yesterday. The one is because the central government has demonstrated very strong political will toward the violence in Hong Kong. I think the harsh line has been taken, the message has been sent out, and those lunatics, those radicals know that they wouldn't get anything with violence. The second reason is the initial passion, the enthusiasm, and the emotion which were very, very strong in the very early stage of the demonstration of the protests, would eventually fade away because they also understand that you cannot count on this to achieve real success and to push the government to do any reform, right? So I think I'm rather optimistic in the long run that the Hong Kong society will come back to normal.
Okay, we have to leave it there. Many thanks. It's a very big discussion, but we have to wait till tomorrow, I guess. Many thanks to Witman Hung, a deputy from Hong Kong for the National People's Congress, and Professor Wang Jiangyu from the National University of Singapore.